Hi, my name's Justin Schuff, and I'm the founder and engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. It's been a little longer than normal since my last video, about a month, so it's been pretty busy with the holidays, as well as our second European user group tour in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland that David James also attended from the product group and MVPs put on in the different countries. So that was a great event. We were happy to sponsor that, but I'm excited to get back to my video tutorial series. So in this video, we're going to be covering user state migration, and this is actually directly based on your feedback from YouTube, Reddit, and Facebook. So a lot of different posts there asking about USMT. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So user state migration tool with regards to Config Manager is a tool within the Windows ADK that allows you to capture and restore user data when you're doing different types of migrations. So the key piece of USMT is really a tool outside of SCCM. Now within USMT, the two key components here are utilities called scanstate and loadstate.exe. So these are the actual tools that are used to save data and load data from a source and destination computer. Within scanstate and loadstate, we do have additional parameters that we can use to choose what you want to migrate with different XMLs. So there's three native ones: MigApp, MigDocs, and MigUser. Now, if any of these native ones don't have what you need to migrate, you can always create your own custom XML to define different reg keys, files, etc. that you want to migrate from a source to destination computer. Now, within the XML, I'll kind of briefly go over what these different ones migrate for you. So by default, when SCCM does a save and restore using USMT, it's going to use the MigApp and MigDocs.xml file. So the first one that we'll look at here is the MigApp. So I'll include a link to this documentation, but by default, MigApp, when it's used, it's got a known list of applications that it can migrate settings for. So I'll include this link for sure, but there's going to be a few different things going on here. Let's see if I can find that. Here we go. So here's the MigApp.xml. So there's a few apps here. So Reader, QuickTime, there's about 30 different built-in apps. Now, if you're using the latest version of USMT, it will also get the latest versions of Office 2016 as well. So it can migrate all your Office settings when you migrate from one PC to the next. So here's the list of kind of all the apps that are built in. Now, the next one that we'll cover is MigDocs. So that's going to be what's used within SCCM by default. So MigDocs is a little bit more inclusive, meaning that it will copy more files in more locations as compared to the MigUser. So for example, MigDocs here will also migrate things that are on the root of the C drive, for example. There's a few directories that exclude, so things like Winder, program files, program data, and users. But all folders in the root of the drive will be copied. All files in the root of any user profile, along with anything within the user profile. So things like documents, downloads, etc. And there's a list of different common shared folders, so common desktop, favorites, documents, etc. And of course, any user folders. Now, MigDocs does actually include a few additional directories within the user profile that MigUser does not. So for example, the downloads, TV, etc. So if we compare all the data that's in MigDocs to MigUser, we can see that it's quite a bit more. So for example, if we look at MigUser here, we can see that it's getting just the music, desktop, a few of the common ones, but for example, it doesn't get downloads. It's not going to get things on the root of C or the root of the profile. And it will also migrate any files with known extension types as well here. All right, so I think that's a good overview of USMT and how it corresponds and how it's going to run to actually capture user state. Now, within SCCM, there's a few components that allow us to help manage where the data gets stored when we're migrating from one PC to the next, along with creating the associations from the source and destination computers. So in the first example, we're going to cover going from a Windows 7 computer to a brand new Windows 10 device. And in this case, we need to store the data somewhere remote since it's a completely separate machine. So the first thing within SCCM that we would want to do is install our state migration point. That's going to be a share that any user data from USMT that gets captured can be stored until it gets restored to the destination machine. So on my site server, you could, of course, add this to any distribution point or site system or create a new one, depending on what you need. So I'm going to go ahead and add this to my existing site server. We're going to add the state migration point. And I have a folder on my local machine here. So under the iDrive, SMP Share for state migration point share. And that's where we're going to create our user state path. We're going to say we want to save user state unless there's only 5 GB left on this machine, on that disk, then we don't want to save it. And a maximum of 100 captures can be stored here at one time. We're going to say we're going to delete the data after it's restored after 3 days. So once it goes to that destination machine that it's restored to, we'll retain that data for up to 3 additional days. You can, of course, assign a boundary group. So by default, we're going to just add our lab group because that's already associated with this site system. But you can, of course, have multiple state migration points to make sure that clients use local DPs or local site systems where they're actually saving and restoring that content too. So like many components, if we go ahead and look at our site server logs, the state migration point is going to be installed from the site comp component. Right, so we can see that's currently installing the state migration point role. So this shouldn't take but a minute or two. There we go, we can see that it's done. Now within our logs, there's going to be this new SMP manager.log. So that's our state migration point manager. And what we can see here is it went out and it created the share for us within that directory. So if we come back here and refresh this folder, we can see that it's created a hidden share that's going to be used to actually store the data. All right, so now that we have our state migration point and we have a general understanding about what USMT does and the 2 different components involved, the first thing that we'll look at here is our USMT package, so our user state migration tool package. This is a package that gets automatically created when you install SCCM. This is a part of the Windows 10 ADK. So this is one of the prerequisites that you would have to have that would be installed for SCCM. So you should already have a default USMT package, and you can see that it's installed in whatever folder that you installed the ADK to. That's where it's going to create the package from. So what we'll look at first is just using the default migration with no custom options or XML. So the first thing that we want to do is go under our assets and compliance, user state migration, and let me go ahead and delete one of these test ones that I had in here to begin with. Now, if you're running through a scenario where you want to replace a machine, so you want to migrate from one machine to another, that's when we would have to use the migration point. So the first thing that we would need to do in order to store that on the migration point, we would need to create an association. So here we go. The first step, or second step after adding our state migration point, is to create the computer association of the source device, right, and the destination device. So if we come back to our console, we're going to create an association. The source computer is going to be a Windows 7 device. So in this simulation, we're going to be going from Windows 7 64-bit to a Windows 10 64-bit device. So here we go. Under user accounts, we'll just choose to capture and restore all user accounts here. And then we'll do OK. So we've got the migration or the association set up. So next thing that we have to do is actually capture the data from the source. So in order to do that, we do need a new task sequence. So if we look under operating systems, task sequences, we're going to go ahead and create a new custom task sequence. So we'll go ahead and do new here. We're going to create a custom one, and we'll call this USMT-capture. Do next here, and then close. So jumping back to our docs, there's a few things that we have to do here for the capture. So there's a request state store step. So that's going to get your state migration point. We then need to either capture or restore the user state, and then we need to release the state store to let it know that it's done capturing or restoring. So in this case, this is going to be our capture task sequence. So we're going to come back in here, we're going to edit it, and we're going to add a new step, user state, and we're going to request the state store. Now, I have noticed, depending on your share permissions, by default, computers are not going to have access to that state migration point share. So you can go ahead and enable access for the network access account in case, if you didn't assign permissions specifically to domain computers, it would fail to connect to that. Now, in this scenario, we're going to be requesting the state for capturing the machine, right? Since this is the capture task sequence. The next step that we need is to actually capture the data. So we're going to go ahead and do user state and then capture user state. So there we go. We're going to browse out and we're going to choose that default USMT package that was created when we installed our site. We'll do OK on that. We're going to use the default options here. So capture all user profiles using standard options. Now, when you enable the standard options, SCCM is going to use the MigApp and the MigDocs. So if we recall, the MigDocs does include a few additional directories like the root of C, the root of profile, and all file extensions within those directories that are not specifically excluded. So this is going to be more inclusive than what you would get if you defined MigUser instead of MigDocs. And then the final step, we're going to release the state store just to let it know that we're done with the capture. So this all looks good. And we'll go ahead and do OK on that. Now within here, we're going to go ahead and deploy this to our source machine. So today I don't have a collection with that machine in it, but I have pre-staged an empty collection. Actually, I think my capture machine is actually in this collection. So we will target this USMT capture collection. We're going to make it available. So if this was a required capture, you could of course make it required and it would automatically kick off. In our case, for this demonstration, we'll make it available and we'll manually kick off the capture through Software Center. We'll leave all the defaults for user experience, alerts, and distribution points, and then OK. Now within this collection, if we look under here that I deployed it, for the capture, it's just a manual direct rule just for this simulation with that Windows 7 device. Now when I used to work with customers, sometimes we would assign different scenarios for replacements by like organizational unit or maybe a security group within AD, and you could simply create your capture collection based on that type of criteria and then kind of target all of those to capture that data. Since we're only working with one machine here just for this demo, we went ahead and just added that machine directly for the capture. So just to speed things up, we'll see if we can go ahead and get this device to check in. So we're going to initiate a computer policy and then OK. All right, so over on that Windows 7 64-bit, we just saw the notification come up. So if we go ahead and click on Software Center, since this task sequence is assigned to just do USMT and there's no boot image, it's actually going to show up in Software Center as an application. So if we go ahead and look here, we can see that it's an app, right? And then here's our task sequence. So this is going to go ahead and capture. So let's go ahead and click that and click Install. So that's going to get the capture running. It's going to be a task sequence just like anything else. So if we look in our CCM logs folder, we can see we have our SMSTS log folder where it's actually going to log out our task sequence. So if we go ahead and open that up, we can see that what's going to happen is going to request the state store. So it found that we have a state migration point it can use to store the capture. So that looks good. Now it's going out and downloading the USMT package. So that's going to contain the scan state, the load state, along with all the additional files that are required for USMT to run. There we go. So it's now just about to the capture step. So we should see the command line kick off with the scan state here momentarily. All right, here we go. So we can see that it's running scan state from the cache folder, right? And it's telling it where to save it to. So it's saving it up to that state migration point share here. We can see that it's using the MigApp and the MigDocs. So we can see that this is really just, config manager is really just calling scan state to save the data, and it's saving it up to that state migration point. So as this runs, let's go ahead and copy that share path. I'm not sure if my account will have permissions. Let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go ahead and paste that in. There we go. It looks like it does. So this is actually copying the files from the machine. And if we look in that TS log, we can actually see the scan state log as well. So this is actually the component doing the capture of the data. So we can see there's a lot of red in here. That's just because it has It's not in a CM trace format, so it's automatically highlighting any text within this log that says error or warning. So that's why we're seeing quite a bit of stuff going on here, even though things are happening okay. Really what we're looking at is that we just return with an exit code of 0 and it's a successful task sequence. But scanstate will give you more details if you ever had a failure in the actual capture. And while we wait for that to capture, just showing you a few things. So we have some documents in my documents folder for the user Justin. We have some desktop icons here and some files on the desktop. We also have a custom wallpaper that's just a System Center wallpaper here. If we open up Internet Explorer, we can see we have a home page currently set to patch my PC along with some favorite options right here in the favorites bar as well. But it looks like that capture did complete. So if we go ahead and look back at that share where it actually stored that, we can see that it stored it in a .mig file for migration. This is actually the same format that you would get if you were using the Easy Transfer wizard, for example, within Windows 7 or Windows 10. So just kind of like a compressed file that's encrypted based on the encryption key that SCCM automatically assigns when we made that association. So at this point, we've got our capture done. So this looks good. So the next thing that we'll look at is our source computer. So within there, we want to create our restore task sequence. So we'll go ahead and create a new one. We're going to do a new custom task sequence and we'll call it USMT-restore. We don't need a boot image, and then we'll do OK here. There we go. So under USMT, we're going to request the state store, but for here, we want to make sure that we are restoring from another computer that captured. We'll also choose the option to use the network access account. We're then going to add the step to restore user state. We're going to also use our default USMT package here. And then finally, once that's done, we're then going to release the state store to let us know that we have now restored the data, and then it can delete it after those 3 days that we assigned. Now we're going to deploy this to a collection. This is also a USMT collection that contains the Windows 10 device I want to restore to. So this is just the direct membership for this example. So we'll deploy it, we'll keep it available, so we manually launch it through Software Center. You could, of course, have this required, assuming that the capture was already performed. You can make that a required so it automatically restores it without any user interaction. So we'll leave all the defaults on deployment and have that deployed. All right, so we'll come back to our collection here. And let's go ahead and have this machine check in for policy to see if we can get this showing up a little faster. Now, I do want to show a few things back on that Windows 7 device. So I have a few documents that I saved on the root of C. So we have the SCCM client installation directory. And we also have this Java update that we're using for testing our patching. So these are both on the root of C. Since we're using the default options, which will be MigDocs, that should include any non-standard files and folders on the root of C. Also on our user profile under Justin, we do have this installation file directly in the profile. So that should get migrated since MigDocs does everything, even in the default profile. And also in the downloads folder, it looks like that file might have actually been removed before I did the capture. So just in the root of the profile, as well as the root of C, we have a couple things that should get migrated because we use the default options, which would be MigDocs, which includes additional files as compared to MigUser. So over here on the Windows 10 device, let's see if we have this showing up in Software Center yet. Not quite yet. That policy must not have mapped in the database. Let's go ahead and request one more time. All right, so that policy request did get the restore task sequence. So that looks good. Let's go ahead and kick this off. And before that gets running, let's go ahead and look at what we currently have going on this Windows 10 machine. So I'm logged in just using the standard administrator account. So we can see that we don't have any user named Justin here. So let's go ahead and look at our TS log. There we go. So we're now at the step to restore user state. So it's downloading our USMT content. And then instead of running scanstate, it's going to run the load state to actually restore the captured data from that Windows 7 device that's up on our state migration point. All right, so here we go. We do a quick zoom on that. Actually, I don't think I have zoom in, but we can see that instead of running scanstate, we're running loadstate. We're pulling the MIG file from that UNC share. We're decrypting it or unencrypting it using our key file from SCCM. We're using our default options, which will be this MigDocs and MigApp.xml. We can see that we've already got some content pulling down. If we look back in that SMSTS folder, we can see instead of scanstate.log, the load state is actually what's going to be doing the restore here. So if you had any failures during the restore, the load state would probably give you more details than the generic error in the SMSTS log. So we can see that we've got our profile coming in, so that's looking pretty good. If we look at my documents, it looks like it's already starting to restore that. If we look at the root of C, let's see if it's got anything going down there. We can see it's got that Java update file already restored. It's already restored the client installation for the CCM setup that we copied on the root of C on that Windows 7 machine as well. So there we go. Looks like the installation is complete. So let me go ahead and log out of this Windows 10 machine as the administrator. And then we'll go ahead and log in using my Justin domain account here. So in this scenario, this would be going from an old computer hardware running Windows 7 or even the same OS, that would be fine. And we're restoring it to a separate computer running a different hardware machine. That's why we had to have the state migration point on the network for this scenario. So if we look at things here, it's looking pretty good. So we have all our shortcuts showing up here. We even have some of those pinned custom icons that I had. If I open up Internet Explorer, we can see that it also has my home page to patch my PC. It's also got some favorites in the favorites bar, and it even has the favorites bar still showing because that's an option that I set in IE. We go ahead and take a look like you would expect that we saw when we were on the administrator. We can see, of course, the Java file. If we look at our documents, we can see that we have our document showing up here. If we look at the root of our profile, we can also see that installation file that we had on the root of Justin. Let's see, there we go. Because we used the MigDocs, which would include anything within that profile directory, regardless of where it's located, even in the root. All right, so I think that this looks good for this scenario. So let's come back to our machine. So this is our Windows 10 machine. So I'm going to go ahead and revert this back to a state before I actually did that restore. So we'll revert that back. And we'll go ahead and power that back on. Now let's go back to our SCCM machine. Now looking back at the USMT, so if we recall, if we come back to our USMT default package that we installed within the ADK, let's take a look at the AMD64 and then look at our XML files. There we go. So like I mentioned, by default, we're going to use the MigApp and MigDocs within SCCM if you did not define any custom options in the restore. But let's say we want to use MigUser instead of MigDocs. So that's going to be more specific. It's not going to include files at the root of drives or in the root of profiles. It's going to be more selective if you didn't want to restore a lot of different locations that might just bring in stuff that you don't want. So in this scenario, we're going to come back to our capture. And within our task sequence under the capture user state, we're going to choose customize how user profiles are captured. Let me see if I can copy this. So we're going to do the MigApp. So that's going to include all the known applications like Office, etc. But instead of MigDocs, we're going to do MigUser. So we'll copy that, paste that, and then OK. We'll apply that. And then we'll also do the same settings within the restore. So we'll customize. We're going to add the MigUser, and then we will add MigDocs, and then OK, and then OK. All right, so we'll let that sit in for a couple seconds so that change can go into the database. And then on the client side, what we'll do is we'll refresh policy to make sure that it has those new settings when we re-kick off this task sequence. All right, there we go. So it didn't look like the first policy check had it in the database yet. We kicked it off a few seconds later, and now we can see all these different policy changes which should be corresponding to that task sequence change. So let's go ahead and click on reinstall. And what we're going to notice here is that when this task sequence kicks off, let's go ahead and look at our logs. So it's going out, it's downloading that USMT package. There we go. So now we can see it's using scanstate, but now it's using MigUser here in MigApp instead of MigDocs. So what we're going to notice in this capture, it's not going to capture all this stuff at the root of C. So we're not going to have the Java file, we're not going to have the client folder, and we're not going to get the installer on the root of the profile. We're going to be more selective, and it's only going to get things that are in like known directories within that documentation. So things like the My Documents, the My Pictures, Wallpaper, App Settings from MigApp. So it's going to not get as much data because we're using MigUser instead of MigDocs. All right, so we can see the new capture just completed. So that will overwrite the existing capture that happened for this different association between this Win 7 and this Win 10 machine. So we can come back to the Windows 10 machine that we reverted. We can see we're back to a clean state with no additional profiles for Justin. And we'll go ahead and kick off this restore. So we'll go ahead and look at that TS log, SMS TS. And what we should see once the content all gets downloaded and it gets to the restore step, when it runs load state, it's going to use MigUser and MigApp, just like the scanstate did on that source machine, because we defined that custom XML path instead of using the default. All right, so here we go. So we can see that our load state tool is now running. It's using our MigDocs. Oh, let's see. Oh, you know, I don't know if I applied this change to the restore task sequence. Let's take a look. Oh, yeah, you know, it looks like instead of the MigApp, I actually typed in MigDocs. So let's go ahead and fix that in the restore. So MigApp.xml. Oh. There we go. Let me just make sure. There we go. Okay, so now that's fixed in the restore. Now let's just take a look. So we did, since we were using MigUser, we of course did get our restore of our profile. Let's just take a look at the root of C. There we go. So since the capture didn't actually use the MigDocs, of course it wasn't able to restore any of that. So this should be pretty similar. So if we look at Justin, we can see that we have our documents, for example. So let's go ahead and log back in as the Justin account. There we go. So we can see that we do, of course, have our background. We have our desktop stuff that was all included in the MigUser. So that looks good. Let's take a look at Internet Explorer. Looks like Internet Explorer settings did in fact migrate over. That must have been included in the MigUser. So that all looks good. I think that that should be good for this scenario. There shouldn't be a need to go and rerun this. It looks like that MigUser did in fact get most of that data that we had captured. But you can see that since we use MigUser instead of MigDocs for the capture, it did exclude all that stuff like at the root of C, at the root of my profile. We don't have that installer. So that could be a good way to be more selective if you didn't want to just capture everything, but you wanted to let your users know that, hey, these are the documents that will be migrated based on the document for TechNet that I include. You could let them know only these folders if you wanted to be more selective than just migrating everything. All right, so I think that that looks good for that scenario. Now, the next thing I want to cover is what if the default options included in the MigApp, MigDocs, or MigUser, what if they don't include some custom app that you might need or a file location? Now, there is a way that you can define your own custom XML file. So there is an example that I'll include on TechNet that has an example of how you could copy different registry keys within here. So I've already copied this and I pasted this into an XML on my desktop. So we can see here that it's just an example of how we can migrate a few different things under HKey current user software, my app, toolbar, just a few scenarios there. Now, I have done some things in the past where I help users create custom ones for some in-house applications to migrate. Now, directly working in the XML, even though this is a good example, it can be quite tedious and take a lot of time. So there is an application. I generally don't recommend anything third-party, but this is a helpful tool. It's called USMT XML Builder. It is $50, I believe, to purchase, but there is a 7-day trial that I'm actually using in this scenario. This is an easy way that you can modify USMT XML templates. So for example, let's say that we wanted to open that sample on the desktop. So here's the actual component. So this is the application sample. It looks like they just called it some application. We can see that it has 4 registry settings that are set to migrate. And if we actually take a click on that, we can see that you get a much easier view to actually view that XML file. So we can see that it's migrating the MyApp toolbar. It's doing any value within there. And then within the default MyApp root folder, it's just migrating the show tips value. We can see that there's an exclude statement here under the MyApp where it's saying don't ever get the display value. They don't want to migrate that for that application to the new machine. So this can be quite helpful if you ever had that scenario where you wanted to make your own. Now, I'm going to go through an example of how we could actually use this in real life. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the sample application in this template, and we're going to create a new one. Now, on this Windows 7 machine, under the Documents folder, I have our Home Updater, so the Patch My PC Home version that you can use to update third-party apps on your home devices. So just because I wrote some of this code and our engineering team did this application, I know exactly where we store the settings. So if we look at regedit, under HQ Local Machine Software, Patch My PC Options, this is where any custom options that you define within this application are stored. So we can see we have quite a few different values set here. If we look at the Options tab, we can see that this is just the different options that are corresponding to those different reg keys. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into our XML Builder tool, and we're going to say, I want to include this application. So we're going to create a new setting for an application. We'll call it Patch My PC Home Updater, and it's an application setting, and we'll click Save. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and then we're going to create a new registry key setting here. So let's go ahead and click that, and we're going to add a new registry value. And on the server that we have this installed, we do have some, I did run the options just so we can use this as an example. So we're going to browse out to the key that we want to save, so Patch My PC Options, and we're going to go ahead and click on the Value tab here, and instead of doing a specific value, we're going to say we want to migrate everything within this Options key. So we're going to put a star there and then click OK. So that, of course, is going to save everything there, and then we'll click Save here. Now, if you wanted to have any files, maybe your application has like some INI files, for example, you could, of course, say, hey, let me migrate this application. Maybe, it's within the program files, for example. So let's say it's in program files. And then you could add like the directory path within program files. Let's say, 7-zip. Let's just say there's an INI file there. You could browse out and say, select the INI, and then we'll put the wildcard there for the program files. And then you could easily migrate things like INI config files for different apps as well. But for Patch My PC Home Updater, we'll just do the registry key, and this should work fine. So I'm going to go ahead and save this template, and I'll just put it on the desktop, and we'll call it Custom.xml. Now, what we're going to do here, since we're going to add a custom XML, I'm not going to add the XML directly into the USMT install folder, just because if USMT was to get updated, it's possible that it might overwrite that. So what I'm going to do is I've already copied that USMT package, and I've stored it on my network source for my share. So I've got a new folder here called USMT, and I named it USMT with options. And of course, I put the version number there so that we can know if USMT gets updated on the server, we might want to copy over the new files and then include our XML within here. Now, since we're working with the 64-bit machine, we're going to include that custom XML directly in the root of 64-bit. Now, if you were doing a 32-bit OS, you would also want to include it in the 32-bit here as well. So we'll go ahead and include that, and then OK. So now what we're going to do, we're going to copy our source path. You can see that it's just the same source as what you got with the default install, with the exception that we added that XML. So what we're going to do, we're going to come into our packages, create a new package. We're going to call this USMT with Custom.xml. We're going to point out to that source path. I'll go ahead and copy that version number. That will be helpful to include within the name so we can know if the version gets updated within the ADK so that we can update this custom package as well. We do not need a program. This is just going to store the files that are going to get called within our task sequence. All right, so that looks good. We're going to go ahead and distribute this out to our DPs. There we go. And just all the defaults here, and that's going to get the content going. Now, what we're going to do back in our task sequence, we're going to go ahead and edit our capture and edit our restore. And instead of using the default packages for the capture and restore step, we're going to go ahead and use our custom package that we created. Within our XML, we do have to add custom here. So we're going to do custom.xml. Let me just browse out here. I do want to make sure that I type this correct. So let's do .xml. Go ahead and copy that directly just to make sure that's right, and then add. So that looks good. So we have our custom package and our custom XML defined in our capture, and we're going to repeat that process for the restore task sequence as well. There we go. And then we'll add the file, and then OK. So we'll give that a few seconds for the policy and that task sequence change to kick in, and then we'll go ahead and refresh the policy on our capture machine here so that it can pick up that new change. But before we do that, let's look back on this Windows 10 machine that we restored using the default options. And if we go ahead and click on Patch My PC, the home updater, what we're going to notice here is that we're not going to have any of those options that migrated over because that wouldn't have been included in the MigApp or the MigDocs or MigUser. So let's go ahead and revert this Windows 10 back to a clean state. All right, so the Win 10 machine is back up and powered on. Back to our Windows 7 capture machine, I did refresh policy and we validated that it got that change. So we're going to go ahead and click on reinstall to run an additional capture. We'll come back to our log files. And what we're going to see here is that when the TS log kicks off, it's going to run our scan state, but it's also going to include that custom XML that we created within our package. If we look at our task sequence folder and our packages, we're going to also notice that the package is going to include the custom.xml here that we created, right? So here's our file that's being used in this custom USMT package. All right, so here we go. If we look at it, we can see we're running scanstate. We can see we have our custom XML, our MigApp, and our MigUser. So we have these three files that we defined here. So this should include just the profile document. It's going to exclude anything on the root of C because we're not using MigDocs. It's also going to include that custom Patch My PC reg key that we generated. All right, so the capture just completed with the new XML. So let's go over to our Win 10 machine and we can see we're back to a clean state with no profile for Justin. Take a quick look at regedit. We can see under local machine, software, we don't currently have any Patch My PC key installed. So we'll go ahead and restore this. Go ahead and look at CCM logs. Right, so we're going to see that USMT package getting downloaded, and then we'll see load state running with our custom XMLs that we added. All right, so here we go. We can see load state running. It's running with the custom XML along with MigUser and MigApp. So that should get our data restored. We should start to see some profiles coming in here. So here's our user for Justin. It's looking good. All right, so we can see the restore is complete. Let's go ahead and refresh that reg key before logging off. There we go. So we can see the options key does look like it migrated. So let's go ahead and log off this admin account. And we will log in this Windows 10 machine with our Justin account, which should have been the one that migrated over. All right, so here we go. If we take a quick look, since we use MigUser, we don't have any of that data on the desktop. We don't have the installer under my profile, but we will of course have our documents. So let's go ahead and launch that Patch My PC app. We'll also go ahead and open up Internet Explorer. That should of course have our home page along with our custom tabs here. So that all looks good. If we look at the options, we can now see that the options for this custom app that we migrated came over just fine. All right, so I think that covers the replace scenario where you're going from one hardware machine to a completely separate one. Now, there might be a few other scenarios where you might want to re-image with the existing machine. So that's what we'll cover next. So to do that, let's go ahead and come back to our task sequences. And we're going to go ahead and create a new task sequence. Now this is going to be, let's say that you have a machine that's not running well and you just want to reformat it and reinstall the operating system, either Windows 7 to Windows 7, for example, or even going from like Windows 7 to Windows 10. So we're going to install an existing image package. We'll call it Windows 10 1809 x64 with USMT. Since this is re-imaging, we do need a boot image, so we're going to do the 64-bit boot image. We're going to choose our image package for our 1809 Win 10. I'm not going to use BitLocker since this is a VM. I am going to give it a local admin password in case something goes wrong. We can still log in and look at what happened. We're going to join a domain. All right, there we go. I'll leave the OU blank since this is re-imaging an existing device. It should map back to the same OU and computer object that it was. Now this is where we can choose whether we want to migrate user state, right? So we have our user state. Now it's going to by default choose the default package, but let's say we want to use our custom one. So USMT with custom. And there we go. So we'll save it on the state migration point because we want to format this and start completely fresh. We will be covering save locally here in a few minutes as well though. Now within this screen, we did not get the option to use Custom XML. We're going to have to come back to our task sequence. So we're not going to do any updates or any apps. So that looks good. So let's go back to our task sequence. And now under the capture step, so capture user files, let's go ahead and do our custom options here. So we have custom.xml. Let's do MigApp.xml, and then MigUser.xml. Okay. We'll go ahead and apply that. We can validate we're using our custom USMT, and then let's do the same for the restore. So we've got MigUser, custom.xml, and then MigApp.xml. Pretty sure I got that typed correctly. Okay, so now just showing you what this task sequence does. We're going to migrate the username. We're going to request the state store. Let's go ahead and enable that option. If the computer account fails, use the network access. And we'll also do that for the the request state store for the restore option down here as well. We'll include that for both. It's then going to capture the user state on the state migration point. Release the state. We're then going to reboot into WinPE. So we're going to deploy this into the client in the full operating system. It's then going to format the disk, apply the image, and then restore the user state. Since this is a VM, I'm just going to disable the driver step for now. All right, that looks good. Now, before we can re-image a device, I want to make sure I delete that association so that it doesn't capture it and have the Windows 10 machine as the destination. Now, if there's no association created at all, it's going to create one with itself automatically. Now, one thing I don't think I talked about for the destination computer, it does need to exist in SCCM. So in order to create that association, if you did want to go to a new machine, you do have an option here where you can import a computer based on the MAC address. So if you needed to get that destination computer in so you could make that association, you could come through here and create it before the machine even gets to you if you don't have the new machine already imaged. Now, I would like to see, I'm probably going to make a user voice. I would like to see where maybe you could run the capture. It creates the association with its own computer object, and then you could change the destination after the fact. I think that would be quite helpful for when the new computer doesn't exist and you maybe don't know the MAC. That doesn't exist today, but I'll put in a user voice, and if you think that would be helpful, be sure to vote that up in the description below. So there we go. So we've got the object deleted for the association. So let's go ahead and target this deployment to our capture collection. And this is going to go ahead and re-image our Windows 7 device. So we're going to target this to the capture. It's going to capture the user state, format the disk, install Windows 10, and then restore it. Now we do need to make sure that this is running in the full operating system. So we're going to keep this as available, but we're going to only run this for config manager clients, meaning that it has to be out with the agent in the full operating system so that we can run the capture. Now, this is where you have to be careful. I'm going to just leave it available so we can manually do it in Software Center. If you made this required, this is where you would really want to make sure that you're only targeting a collection that you actually want to re-image. So, that can be a risky scenario if you accidentally deployed this and re-imaged a collection that you weren't intentionally targeting for re-imaging and formatting. So we're going to go ahead and just keep that available. So we have to manually launch it in Software Center on the capture collection that contains our one Windows 7 device. All right, so let's go ahead and launch policy refresh, see if we can get this task sequence showing up here. See if that policy's kicked in yet. Doesn't look like it's got it quite yet. Let's try once more. There we go. We can see the policy downloading, so we should get notified here in a second. There we go. So we have our new operating system image task sequence. So we're going to go ahead and kick this off. So what's going to happen in this scenario is it's going to go from Windows 7 to Windows 10. It's going to capture the user state in the full operating system. So we can see it just requested the state store. It's now going to capture it just like we did with all the other ones. The only difference is when this one releases the state, when it's done, it's then going to reboot and re-image the device in WinPE and go through a full imaging scenario. Now, of course, if you were going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, you could, of course, use the in-place upgrade task sequence and just have the native Windows 10 setup do all the migration for you, which is even a little bit more complete with migrating everything. But if you ever wanted to start fresh, this could be a scenario where you go from Windows 7 to Windows 10, or maybe Windows 7 to Windows 7 if you're not quite ready for 10 yet. And so here we go. We can see that we're using our MigUser and all our options here. All right, so the capture is done. It's now downloading the boot image, and it's going to go ahead and reboot into WinPE, and then it's going to go ahead and start upgrading us to Windows 10 along with formatting the disk. So there we go. We're now going to restart into PE. So we lost our RDP connection. If we look back here through Hyper-V, we'll kind of see this imaging process start to kick off on this machine. All right, so there's our partitioning. So it's going to format the disk, but that's all right. We've already got our state captured up to the state migration point on the share. All right, so while we wait for this machine to re-image, I do want to cover the final scenario that we'll be looking at. Now, this one's going to be if you're re-imaging an existing device, when you're using the same machine, you do have the ability where you can capture user state and you can actually store that locally on the machine so you don't have to save it up to the network using the state migration point. So I'll show you what that looks like. So we're going to create a new task sequence, Windows 10 1809 x64, and we'll call it USMT offline. Choose our boot image, do next here, install our package, Windows 10 1809. We won't do BitLocker, enable the local. There we go. All right, so we've got our domain join, that looks good. Now for this one, when we do our state migration point, let's go ahead and choose our custom package. We're going to choose to save it locally. So what happens here is that instead of saving it up to the network using the state migration point, it actually creates a hard link and it stores it all locally. And instead of formatting the disk, it's going to wipe all the data around the user data that we back up instead of formatting the drive. So that makes it so you don't have to store it remotely to your state migration point share. You can just have it locally during this. So to take a look at what this looks like, let's go ahead and edit our sequence. So we can see it's pretty similar. We're going to start with the username, but instead of here, we have it to set the local state location. So that's going to store it locally on the hard drive. Now, when it gets to the format step, it's going to say, hey, we're not going to format the disk because we have it set to store the data locally. So instead, it's going to go ahead and wipe all the data around the content. So things like the Windows directory, the program files, it's going to wipe all that content, but it's not going to actually format it because we're still going to have the data that exist on that disk. So let's go ahead and add our file. So we have custom.xml. Let's do MigApp.xml. And then let's do MigUser.xml here. Do OK on that. We'll come back to the restore and we'll also add that there. So custom.xml, MigApp.xml, and then MigUser.xml. Do OK on that and then apply. And we should be good here. All right, so we'll go ahead and do the same thing with targeting our capture collection. So once the Windows 10 machine gets done doing the re-imaging using the state migration point, we'll revert it back and then we'll go ahead and run the offline version to upgrade to Windows 10, saving everything locally. So same options here. This does have to initially run in the full operating system to capture the data. We're going to keep it available and for config manager clients. And we'll leave all the defaults here. All right, so jumping back to our machine, it looks like it just applied the image. So it's going to go through now, go through Ubi, install the client, and then we should get to the restore step within a few minutes. So at this point, we're now restoring the user state. So the task sequence has installed Windows 10. It's now in the full operating system. It's going to go ahead and download and restore the user state from the state migration point, just like the previous task sequences did that weren't OSD. All right, the imaging is now done. Let's go ahead and see if we can log into this machine. All right, so we're now logged in. We can see that we went from Windows 7 to Windows 10, formatting the disk, capturing and restoring data. So everything looks about the same. So this looks good. So let's go ahead and look at documents. All looks good. Let's go ahead and launch this. We'll launch IE. Go. We can see all the options came over. We have our home page, our favorites bar. This all looks good. So let's go ahead and revert back and then we're going to do the offline version. All right, so we're back to a clean state. It looks like we're just getting policy refreshed. So we should see that. There we go. New changes. Oh, not yet. We should get our notification any minute now that we have our new operating system deployment available. All right, there we go. So we'll go ahead and kick off that USMT offline task sequence, and I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so we can now see the migration is now happening, but if we look at the scan state, we can see instead of saving it to our state migration point, we are saving it locally on this hard drive. We can also see that we used a local only option and hard link to actually do the capture. So that looks good. So it's currently saving that all locally to the SMS task sequence folder on the root of C. So it's creating a mapping to all the files that USMT is determining that we need to back up here. So we'll let that finish. All right, so the capture is now done. It's now going to restart into WinPE. All right, now we're going to notice here that the format step is going to be completely skipped because we have data saved locally, and it's going to go directly to the apply operating system step. There we go. Now, just to show you what actually happened in the background, if we open up command prompt, what we're going to see happening during the apply operating system is it's going to wipe the disk instead of format. So it's going to wipe all the non-saved data, so things like Windows, program files, client, all these things will get wiped. But what's actually going to get retained is the USMT state that's saved locally. So within that user state folder, we can see all the data that is actually pointing to the backup where things happened. All that data is going to get retained. So here's, for example, our documents. That's all going to get retained and restored once the new image is applied and we get to the restore step. So everything else is going to be exactly the same, but instead of storing it all locally, since we're using the same hardware, it's going to store it all on this device, and it's going to simply wipe it instead of format. So here we go. We can see the wiping happening now. So on that D Windows drive, it's going to start wiping all the non-backed up data. So we can see that it's wiped everything so far except the Windows directory. So once it's done wiping, it's then going to start applying the image to that wiped D drive. Now, if you wanted to move from BIOS to UEFI, this might not be a good scenario because generally it's where you would want to make additional partitions so it's UEFI compatible. So this could maybe be just Windows 7 to Windows 7 or Win 10 to Win 10 if you just wanted to re-image and store data locally. You may not want to use this if you want to go from legacy BIOS to UEFI, for example, during a Win 7 to Win 10 upgrade. So now we can see we're applying the image, so it's going to start applying the image to that wiped disk. But we can of course see that all our data of course was unaffected where it created the hard links to where that data actually exists on the hard drive. So this will all get restored once the image is applied when we get to the restore step. All right, so I do have to run and catch a plane to MMS Desert Edition. Plane leaves in about under 2 hours now. I still have to drive to the airport. But really the only difference going forward here is that when it does the restore, instead of getting it from that state migration point, it's just going to restore it all from that local mapping that it did on the hard drive since we didn't format that. Everything else with the restore is going to be exactly the same. It's going to use load state. It's going to point to that SMSTS user state folder to actually pull that back and direct it back into the profile directory and have all my data back where it was. I hope this video was helpful.